So now I'm going to read from Luke chapter 16, starting at verse 1 and going through to verse 15. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich young man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So, if you had not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight."
I knew something was wrong when I heard Tom talking to himself. He was mildly agitated. There was something big going on in his life, or in his mind, or perhaps both. Then as I listened, and as he continued ruminating, I began to piece the situation together. Tom was anxious and fearful that he was letting God down. He had an absolute unshakable conviction that God had placed him on earth to stop people eating sugar and to teach them to swim. I wasn't sure how these two assignments were related to each other, but he was becoming increasingly worked up as he reflected that he wasn't carrying out the task adequately. He felt a terrible weight of guilt. Later that same day, the stress became overwhelming for him, and his talking to himself was transformed into a gruesome attempt to put an end to his unbearable inner conflict. It was a pretty bad ending. We saved him, but it was touch and go. Tom was a patient in the psychiatric unit where I was working. He was a Vietnam vet, not your average person, but he taught me that talking to yourself can often be an indicator of severe stress or even desperation. Of course, you don't have to be odd or psychotic to do it. I speak for myself. I speak to myself. It can even be a sign of very high cognitive functioning. Oscar Wilde wrote this: "I like hearing myself talk. It is one of my greatest pleasures. I often have long conversations all by myself, and I'm so clever that I sometimes don't understand a single word of what I'm saying." Very witty, Wilde, very witty. But talking to yourself can frequently be a sign of serious stress and worry, or of something bad or momentous about to happen, or even of mischievous plotting. And in Luke, particularly, It often is. There's a string of them. Remember the rich fool? He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." Or the stupid servant in Luke 12. Suppose the servant says to himself, "My master is taking a long time in coming," and he begins to beat the men servants and maid servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master will come on a day when he does not expect him. He will cut him to pieces. The lost son that we met last week in chapter 15, who came to his senses and said to himself, "Here I am starving to death. I'll set out and go back to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.'" The judge in chapter 18, who feared neither God nor people. "Even though I don't fear God, I'll see this widow gets justice because she keeps bothering me." And that distressed vineyard owner in Luke 20, the wicked tenant's parable. "What shall I do? I'll send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they'll respect him." Moments of high stress. And here in chapter 16 is one highly stressed, desperate man who's about to lose his job, who's talking to himself. "You cannot be my manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. Retrenchment, redundancy is a frightening thing to face. Do you know the feeling? They don't want me anymore." Now, keep the context of this parable in mind. Jesus is on that long, determined journey to Jerusalem, to the cross, to die to save his people. It started at the end of chapter 9. And as he goes, he's constantly teaching his disciples, literally his followers, those who are walking along with him on the way to Jerusalem. He's teaching them what he expects of them, what genuine discipleship looks like. And all through this long section in Luke, Jesus keeps juxtaposing cost with warnings. The cost of being a disciple and warnings to the would-be disciple. And the two themes intersect here in this parable. Jesus teaching about what authentic discipleship will be, what its cost will be to his disciples, and a warning that flows from that. He's just finished telling a parable about a son who got himself into a major mess, then acted decisively to get out of it. And now here's another man, a manager, who's got himself into a major mess and acts decisively to extricate himself from it. Have you noticed they have quite a lot in common, these two parables? Both these men are squanderers. Both betray a trust they've been given. Both make plans. Both have merciful masters who could send them to jail, but who don't punish them. Neither of them tries to defend himself or to make excuses. But this one is an awkward parable with a more awkward conclusion. Jesus seems to draw a moral from immorality. And it's the only time he does that. It's a story of somebody cooking the books, but apparently meeting with Jesus' approval. That sounds like a hermeneutical headache, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And the master is introduced as a rich man. Now, in the New Testament, especially Luke, rich men usually don't get our sympathy. So we almost want the crooked, unreliable manager to be the winner, don't we? I'm sure the first listeners did. Think Robin Hood. Think Bonnie and Clyde. Think Vin Diesel in Fast and Furious. Let's review the story so we can decide what's really going on here. The manager, or steward, he's often called, was employed to run the wealthy owner's house and his business for him. If there were no children, in the family, then perhaps he was even in line to inherit it. Do you remember childless Abraham in Genesis 15 planning to leave his inheritance to his slave Eliezer because there was no alternative? This manager was probably deeply trusted by the owner and his family. He may even have grown up as a servant on the family property, and then he was accused of wasting, squandering the master's possessions. Was it fraud? Intentional? Was it carelessness? We don't know. But the owner is no fool, and he called him to account. He demanded a full and transparent set of accounts so that he could work out what his own liabilities would be. Gave the manager no chance to defend himself, so the manager didn't even try. He was defenceless, and he was suddenly, tragically unemployed. He doesn't know what to do. It's his existential crisis. This is serious. He knows the future and the next life is just around the corner. So what can he do to cut his losses and make the next stage, or perhaps the next life, more palatable? Time to talk to himself. Perhaps he's a verbal processor. It is the cutest thing, isn't it, when a verbal processor says, I'm a verbal processor, so blah, 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 blah. You think, thank you for letting me know. He can't dig, right? He can't remotely imagine himself what those buff council workers are doing in Badminton Road this week, right? But he can't see himself busking at Wynyard or sitting in a blanket in Burwood holding a card, homeless, please help. Those things are just not his world. They wouldn't work, and he's not prepared to try anyway. But then, verse 4, his desperate self-talk produces a genius plan, simple but clever. I know what I'll do. And he calls in the boss's debtors one by one and drastically reduces their debts. He's in a hurry. You might think, why did he reduce the first one by 50% and the second one by less than that? Well, it turns out the values by which each debt was reduced are almost exactly the same. So he's working very fast here, taking the same amount roughly off each debt. How Jim Chalmers, the federal minister, federal treasurer, must long to find a solution as clear-cut as this for Australia's $1,000 billion national debt. The offer this man has made to each debtor, and these are huge debts they owe, these are big-time operators, is more than enough to guarantee himself a warm welcome later. And he talks to them individually, privately, because he doesn't want them spreading this around, doesn't want them asking questions. He has to work fast before the owner finds out what he's doing and before the debtors realise that he no longer has authority to do this. It's a very cunning plan. My first part-time job, packing fruit and veg in a shop at Chatswood, came to a swift and miserable end when I threw several boxes of good produce into a dumpster bin by mistake. Now, that came close to an existential crisis for a 15-year-old schoolboy. If you've been terminated or retrenched at short notice, or if you've dismissed an employee, you might understand this man's predicament and its brutal speed, especially in companies where a lot of money is at stake. Don't go back to your desk unaccompanied. Don't touch your computer. You don't give that employee any chance to devise a sudden scam and take with him all that he can get away with. Now, we know how effective Jesus was at shocking people. And here comes the bombshell at the end of the parable, in verses 8 and 9. The master, Hokurios, is that the steward's master, or is it the Lord, Jesus' master? Could be either. The master commended the dishonest manager. This man, trying to safeguard his future by wasting more of his master's money, is commended, at least by Jesus and possibly by the owner as well. What could the boss have done? He's been outsmarted. All the paperwork was in order. The accounts were drawn up as he'd requested in verse 2, week 2. It is week 2. And the manager had guaranteed the long-term goodwill of both the debtors to himself and their goodwill to his apparently generous master, on whose behalf he was acting. This is the mother of clever scams. And what makes the parable all the more tricky is that Jesus seems to commend him too. It's a bit worrying, isn't it? What lesson did Jesus want to teach about discipleship? Why choose dishonesty and a dodgy business deal by a crook to make his point? Jesus, give us a break here. Well, look carefully at verse 8, at what the man's master admired. It wasn't dishonesty or cheating or swindling that he praised. It wasn't his methods or his morality, but that he acted shrewdly. What does shrewd mean? Well, I checked in the Oxford English Dictionary, and the simple definition is astute or sharp in practical matters. Astute or sharp in practical matters. Nothing negative necessarily about it. Fair enough. He acted shrewdly, astutely, sharply in practical matters. But do you find yourself thinking, yes, but why use this story and this character to teach about discipleship, Jesus? Look back to the beginning of chapter 15. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering round to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." The religious leaders were confused. How could tax collectors and sinners be following Jesus and listening to him? And how could they belong in God's family? Even potentially. So Jesus told them a parable to explain how God's mercy and delight in saving the lost. 3 parables, in fact. Now in chapter 16, he's teaching his disciples, those following him. The group of his disciples certainly had their fair share of tax collectors and sinners and swindlers amongst them. People who'd once cooked the books and done dodgy deals. So this parable explains to them not that they should be squandering or dishonest, but that they should be shrewd, astute or sharp in practical matters. Now, Jesus makes no pretense about what this manager is really like. He's a waster. He's a squanderer in verse 1. He's unrighteous or dishonest, adikia, in verse 8. He's a rotter. But Jesus takes a bad person and isolates one good quality, his shrewdness, his foresight, his wisdom about how to act now in light of what the future holds. He commends that, and Jesus points out in verse 8 that the world, the sons of this age, he calls them, literally, can often be better at that than we naive Christians are. Get the point? Jesus says to his disciples, the dishonest man knew how the world works, and so he acted astutely, sharply, shrewdly in practical matters. He had the emotional intelligence to connect well with people. He knew what he had to do if he wanted to ensure a workable future for himself. He knew how to move quickly while he could. And Jesus, teaching about being his disciples, explains that we Jesus people need to have that same kind of shrewdness, analysis, rigorous forethought, careful planning, and understanding of our times and our circumstances. Like this manager who's a realist, right? His job is finished. He's facing dismissal. He knows what's coming. He does what he can to prepare for that certainty. Do what we can now, says Jesus, to prepare for what we know is ahead. What is ahead? Do you remember Peter's words in Acts chapter 10 to Cornelius and his household? He said, he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he's the one whom God has appointed as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. What's the future certainty? Judgment. Forgiveness of sins for those who trust him through believing. It's what you're doing here, isn't it? What a stupid idea to come to Bible college. Your job, the cost, a fee help debt or another fee help debt, uprooting yourself from family and friends or church or state or your country. For some of you, incurring the anger or the disapproval of your parents. Radical, risky, stupid, but shrewd. Astute or sharp in practical matters. Well done. As a missionary doctor friend of mine who had spent over 20 years on the mission field in a remote place once said to me, it's professional suicide. But where would this people group be without the gospel of life? When everything was at stake, the manager staked everything on this daring course of action. Learn from that, Jesus tells his disciples. Imitate his concern for the future by acting thoughtfully and decisively now, not by drifting along and letting life happen around you, letting life just take its course, but rather understanding the unbelieving world, understanding the urgency and the certain future, and taking serious action. Look at Jesus' words in verse 9. What do we have now? Worldly wealth, literally unrighteous mammon. He uses the same adjective to describe wealth here as he used to describe the manager in verse 8. False, unrighteous, untrustworthy. Wealth is untrustworthy because it promises security, but it doesn't deliver it. The money wasn't the manager's, it belonged to his master. Our money isn't ours, it belongs to God. So while you have it, says Jesus, use it for eternity, for gospel purposes. Money doesn't last, so use it to serve God. It's not buying your way into heaven, but letting heaven determine what you buy. Using worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself and a welcome in eternity. Now that might sound like self-centred opportunism. It's a worrying line, isn't it? But the point is simple. Mr. Shrewd used it now to provide for the future. So should we, disciples. Evangelism has to come free, doesn't it? You can't charge people to hear the gospel. But someone has to pay to make it happen, to enable people to be gospel proclaimers, whether it's on a uni campus or in Cuba PD or in Central Asia or in school classrooms in Sydney. Use it now because you know the future with certainty, because you know what's at stake. My friend Stephen, a barrister, died unexpectedly at 53, 7 weeks from diagnosis to death. High earning capacity, gone. A great and generous supporter of gospel mission in Australia and in terribly needy places way beyond. Now picture, if you can, some of those in darkness who heard the good news and believed. When they finally enter into the joy of the Lord, I imagine they might well have a chance to gather around Stephen and to say, thank you, thank you, thank you. What for? Who are you? I don't think I've met you before. But Stephen, it was your hard work, your money, your astute practical planning, your gospel heart of generosity that helped missionary messengers bring us the gospel. Your intentional, generous folly helped bring us life forever. The manager's security. Delighted welcome into the houses of the debtors. But that would only last as long as the debtors and their houses lasted. One day they and their houses would be gone and forgotten. Shaky, temporary security. But security for Jesus' disciples is guaranteed by God and will last forever. I have no doubt there will be some surprises for us in store if we're shrewd. And notice, would you, how intentional the manager's action was. In verse 3, after that bitter blow of dismissal, he sat down, talked to himself, thought strategically, and planned carefully. We can be lazy and disorganised about kingdom generosity, can't we? Not hard. I'll just give what I have left over at the time. Jesus calls his disciples to be intentionally shrewd, like this man, astute and sharp, making the most of what he had before it slipped away. And that's what Jesus said he's looking for in a disciple. Righto, Jesus, point made, crystal clear, the parable's over, challenge thrown down, job done. Let's leave it there with the punchline of verse 9. But Jesus says, no, let's not leave it there. And look what happened after Jesus told this parable. Verse 14, the Pharisees who loved money were sneering. It's good words, isn't it? Sneering. It's a deliciously graphic word, the Greek word. Ekmukterizo. Ekmukterizo. Literally, turning up your nose at someone. Hippocrates, the great 5th century BC Greek physician, used it to mean a nosebleed. Your mukter in Greek was your nose. Sneering. Strong contempt. You get the picture. Up your nose, Jesus of Nazareth. That's what the Pharisees were saying. They were solidly unimpressed and unmoved by his challenge. You'll notice Jesus had added a little sting in the end of the tale after the story. In verses 10 to 13, a little appendix, the money lover's warning. Because it's perfectly possible for us to know something is true, but not take it to heart. And he wanted his disciples to get this deeply into their hearts. So in verse 10, Jesus spoke about what we, his disciples, have now in this life: bank accounts, employment, position, friends, status, talents, investments, as being very little compared to what we'll enjoy in the future, the age to come. But you'll see in verses 11 and 12 that the little things matter. See his argument? If God can't trust you with very little, why should he trust you with very much? If we haven't been trustworthy with someone else's property, God's property, on loan to us for no longer than a fleeting lifetime, then why should he trust us with true heavenly riches? And what are the true riches, Jesus? Glory in my Father's presence, not on loan, but truly and eternally ours. Now, in this parable, Jesus is, of course, pointedly discussing trustworthiness with money, worldly wealth. But it behoves us to think about where else you might apply his warning. How do others trust you? And how do they trust me? What little things do others entrust you with? Money? Time? The truth? Their confidences? Copyright and their intellectual property? The quality of your work? Their children? Their children's Christian growth? The gospel? Sure, money is in the spotlight here, but the same principle applies, doesn't it? Those who can be trusted will be faithful, whether the amount is small or large. Those who can't will be unfaithful, regardless of the amount. The little things matter. Are you and am I worthy of trust? From little things, big things grow. Jesus is not one for political correctness, is he? He doesn't believe that money and religion have nothing to do with each other. He doesn't agree that worldly finances have nothing to do with true faith. And his disciples, he says, have to take that seriously because faith is expressed partly through our wallets. The way we use money and resources now are an index to our inner person, our hearts. I don't think Jesus is forcing us or twisting our arms. He's simply telling his disciples that generosity, shrewd, astute generosity, is not losing, but it's investing. Behind money and financial resources, idolatry lurks. And he drives the point home with a strikingly uncompromising statement in verse 13. You cannot serve two masters, both God and money. Yes, we want to say, yes, I realise the danger of serving two masters. I realise it's difficult. It'd be wiser not to try to serve two masters, both God and money. I shouldn't try. Jesus says, no, not you shouldn't. You can't. You'll always be serving one or the other. So which one is it? You have to decide. You have to make the choice and keep making the choice. You have to keep deciding who your master really is. I have to keep listening to Jesus' words and avoiding sneering at them, turning up my nose at him. Money is not my master. Jesus is. Don't turn up your nose at Jesus, will you? Listen to him when he challenges you about your idols of worldly security that he knows you love to cling on to. And he knows your hearts, verse 15. There's hope for disciples. God knows your hearts. There's a cost there and there's a serious warning. But because he knows our hearts, he can change them by his Spirit and lead us to repentance and obedience. Where was Jesus going as he told this parable? To Jerusalem, to death, to pay the price for the idolatry that was never his, but ours. We're saved, we're God's friends by grace. We're not saved by our generosity, we're saved by Jesus' generosity. Because of his great love for us, God, who's rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It's by grace you've been saved. But we are his disciples, and we will be held accountable for our discipleship. We won't be condemned, but we will be examined. Act shrewdly in light of the day when you'll stand before God, not in light of the 30th of June each year. There are seasons in life, aren't there? There are seasons when we can be more liberal, more generous with money, and seasons when things are tighter and more difficult. With our children now young adults and supporting themselves, we're finding ourselves in a season of relative plenty. Be careful, Jesus says. Be careful in a season of relative plenty because you want to spend it on yourself. Be a true investor, Jesus told his disciples. Be a true investor, he tells us. Wealth is a very bad, a very dangerous master, but it's a very useful servant. Be astute or sharp in practical matters. This manager had a certain future, the sudden and unavoidable loss of his job. And he made strategic, present decisions based on that certain future. And that, Jesus says to his disciples and to us, is how we're to think and to act. Act shrewdly. In our family Monopoly games over the years, my third daughter, the second twin who always had something to prove, was the shrewd entrepreneur who invariably, infuriatingly came out on top. What's certainty? What's the certainty in a game of Monopoly? Wealth. Wealth. More for some players than for others. There are properties purchased, there are houses and hotels built and bought and sold, fortunes made and lost. But at the end of the game, it all goes back in the box. Gone. Finished. The end. Your wallet, your investments, your securities don't control you. You control them. Don't let them dictate to you. You're a disciple. Make up your mind. Choose your master. You cannot serve both God and money, but you can risk everything on the mercy of your master. Shall we pray? Our Father in heaven, you are entirely gracious. We thank you for that. We thank you for Jesus' journey to Jerusalem to pay for our idolatry, for our selfishness, for our poor discipleship. We thank you that his sacrifice and his resurrection is where our trust lies. Work in us, please, by your Spirit, to make us obedient disciples, not tight-fisted, but open-handed for the kingdom. And we pray in the King's name. Amen.